Welcome, history enthusiasts, to this captivating journey into one of medieval England's most remarkable uprisings, the Peasants' Revolt of Sambai. In this video, we will step back over 6 centuries to explore an age of hardship, courage, and resistance. Imagine a world where heavy taxes burdened the common people, where the echoes of the Black Death were still fresh, and where the ruling crown sought to tighten its grip on those who had little. But in this world, ordinary men and women dared to defy the powerful and rise against oppression. Through this documentary-style narrative, you will witness the tense moments that sparked the revolt, the fiery words of leaders like Wat Tyler and John Ball, and the fierce determination of peasants who demanded justice. We'll delve deep into their struggles, triumphs, and ultimate sacrifices, stories that still resonate today as powerful reminders of resilience and unity. So, sit back, prepare your minds, and let's uncover the forgotten tales of a revolt that shook medieval England to its core. In the late 13th century, England was a nation struggling under the weight of disease, war, and crushing social inequality. The Black Death, which swept through Europe in the mid-Sambites, had wiped out nearly half of England's population. Fields lay untended, villages were abandoned, and fear haunted every shadowed lane. Those who survived found themselves carrying the burden of both rebuilding and paying for the monarchy's costly ambitions, especially the ongoing 100 Years' War with France. For the peasant class, life was especially grim. They were bound by the feudal system, forced to serve landlords and pay heavy dues. On top of this, the crown demanded increasingly harsh taxes, including the infamous poll tax, which charged every individual regardless of their income or status. It was a crushing blow to the already impoverished commoners. Tensions simmered across the countryside. Farmers, artisans, and laborers whispered of injustice in hushed voices, their patience thinning with every passing year. Rumors of rebellion floated through marketplaces and taverns. A sense of shared suffering began to unite the common folk. Men and women who had once lived quietly under the shadow of lords and bishops. This chapter sets the stage for the revolt to come. We meet the ordinary people who, though nameless in history, carried the seeds of defiance in their hearts. The world around them was harsh, but the desire for freedom and dignity would soon burn brighter than their fear. The Black Death left scars far deeper than anyone could have imagined. From Sambai to Sambai, the plague swept across Europe like a dark tide, erasing entire communities in its path. In England, the death toll was staggering. Villages were left empty, churches abandoned, and farmlands reclaimed by weeds. Survivors emerged into a world forever altered, where silence haunted the countryside, and the absence of neighbors was a grim reminder of death's cruelty. Yet, paradoxically, the plague also shifted the balance of power, however briefly. With so many lives lost, labor became scarce. Peasants who had once been chained by the feudal system suddenly found their work in high demand. They asked for better wages, improved living conditions, and freedom from oppressive obligations. But the ruling class, clinging to old traditions, was quick to crush these ambitions. The Statute of Laborers, Sambai, was introduced, fixing wages at pre-plague levels and forcing workers to accept the same harsh conditions as before. This unjust law became a festering wound in the hearts of the poor. Peasants, the Black Death was not only a tragedy, but also a cruel reminder that even death could not break the chains of feudalism. The nobles continued to prosper, while the peasants remained trapped in misery. As whispers of rebellion began to spread, the memory of the plague acted like fuel, to a smoldering fire. "We have suffered enough," became a common refrain, passed from mouth to mouth like a secret spell of defiance. The peasants began to see the possibility of a world where they could stand as equals, no longer living in fear of both disease and their overlords. In the years following the plague, England's rulers found themselves in dire need of funds. The 100 Years' War with France was draining the royal treasury, and the crown sought new ways to finance its ambitions. The answer came in the form of oppressive taxes, levied not on the wealthy nobility but on the backs of commoners, already struggling to survive. Among these, the poll tax became the most hated. The poll tax was a flat fee charged to every person, rich or poor, without consideration of income or social standing. For peasants who barely earned enough to feed their families, this tax was nothing short of catastrophic. Villagers often had to sell their few possessions, livestock, or even food stores just to pay the collectors who came knocking on their doors. What stung most was the arrogance of the officials. Tax collectors, often flanked by armed guards, scoured the countryside, prying into homes to ensure that no one escaped payment. Rumors of corruption only heightened the resentment. Stories of collectors pocketing extra coins or using violence to enforce the tax spread like wildfire. The mood in villages shifted from weary acceptance to quiet rebellion. Farmers and laborers began to murmur that enough was enough. The once quiet streets now echoed with discontent. Families would gather in secret to discuss ways to resist the crown's demands. In taverns and market squares, voices rose in anger as peasants debated how long they would endure the yoke of injustice. The spark of revolt was close. The poll tax, unfair and unyielding, would prove to be the breaking point for a people who had already lost so much to war and disease, and the flames of rebellion often begin with a single spark. A moment when fear gives way to anger and submission turns. In the early months of Basari, that spark ignited across southern England. The third poll tax in just a few years pushed the people beyond their limits. Villagers who had once quietly paid their dues now openly refused, daring the crown to enforce its will. The revolt's first embers were lit in Essex and Kent. Local officials arrived to conduct yet another tax survey, but the villagers would not cooperate. Armed with farming tools, clubs, and sheer determination, they drove out the tax collectors, declaring that they would pay no more. Word of this defiance spread quickly, carried on the lips of travelers and merchants who moved between towns. Soon, similar acts of resistance erupted across the countryside, in taverns and village squares. Voices like that of John Ball, the fiery priest, gave shape to the people's anger. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? He asked, preaching the radical idea that all men were created equal. His words struck the hearts of the peasants like thunder, giving them courage to stand against their oppressors. As tensions mounted, groups of commoners began to gather secretly, forming alliances and planning their next moves. Farmers sharpened scythes, blacksmiths forged makeshift weapons, and messengers spread the call to rise. It was no longer a question of if they would fight. It was a matter of when. This chapter marks the turning point where frustration transformed into action. The people of England were ready to challenge the system that had bound them for centuries. They were no longer just peasants. They were a movement. Among the scattered leaders of the early rebellion, one name would rise above the rest: Wat Tyler. A skilled tiler and craftsman from Kent, Tyler was not born into leadership, nor did he seek fame. Yet, when the call for action echoed across the villages, he stepped forward, driven by a sense of justice and determination. Wat Tyler's reputation spread quickly. Known for his strong character and sharp intellect, he earned the respect of both peasants and artisans. Unlike many who were fueled only by rage, Tyler understood strategy and organization. He rallied groups of men, urging them to fight not just with anger, but with purpose. "We are as good as the Lord's," he declared, "and no man should be their slave." As Tyler's influence grew, he became the central figure in Kent's uprising. Under his guidance, small bands of rebels united into a formidable force. They planned their march towards London not as scattered mobs, but as a collective voice demanding change. Tyler's leadership was marked by discipline. He forbade unnecessary violence, ensuring that the rebellion's cause would not be tarnished by lawless acts. Wat Tyler was a man of the people. He spoke their language, shared their hardships, and dreamed their dreams. His leadership would prove crucial in transforming local uprisings into a national movement that could not be ignored. No voice stirred the hearts of the peasants quite like John Ball, the radical priest who preached equality in an age when society was bound by rigid hierarchies. Known for his fiery sermons and bold ideas, Ball challenged the very foundation of medieval England's power structure. He believed that all men were created equal in the eyes of God, a dangerous belief that could topple the feudal system if it took root among the people. Ball had long been in conflict with the church and the crown. His unorthodox teachings led to his imprisonment multiple times, yet his spirit remained unbroken. With every sermon, he reminded the peasants that they were not destined to live as slaves to their lords. His most famous words, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" echoed through the countryside like a battle cry, questioning the divine right of kings and nobles. As rebellion brewed, John Ball's voice became the moral compass of the movement. He traveled from village to village, often preaching in open fields or beneath towering trees, where hundreds of peasants gathered to hear his words. His sermons were not just spiritual, they were calls to action, urging the common people to rise against injustice and claim their God-given freedom. Ball's influence was instrumental in uniting the rebels under a shared vision. He gave them not just a reason to fight, but a dream of a better, fairer world. His words would resonate far beyond the revolt, becoming symbols of hope and defiance for generations to come. Echoed by early June 1873, the rebellion had gained unstoppable momentum. Villages across Kent united under a single cause to march on London and confront the king. Under the leadership of Wat Tyler and guided by John Ball's radical ideas, thousands of peasants, farmers, and laborers began gathering in the county's open fields, their numbers growing daily. This was no longer a scattered uprising, it was a people's army. The gathering at Kent was both chaotic and inspiring. Men brought scythes, pitchforks, and homemade weapons, while women carried supplies, food, and water for the long journey ahead. Blacksmiths worked tirelessly, forging crude blades from farming tools, and carpenters built makeshift shields. For many, this was their first taste of freedom, standing shoulder to shoulder with others who shared their anger and hope. Wat Tyler addressed the growing crowd, his voice carrying over the murmurs of thousands. "We are the strength of England," he proclaimed. "No man is born to bow his head forever." His words were met with roars of approval. Flags fashioned from old rags waved in the breeze, each one a symbol of resistance. As night fell, fires dotted the Kentish fields. The rebels shared stories, sang songs of defiance, and planned their route to London. Spirits were high, but so was the tension. They knew the path ahead would be perilous. For the first time, peasants from different villages and walks of life were united in a common dream: freedom from the yoke of oppression. The gathering at Kent marked the true beginning of the Peasants' Revolt as a nationwide force. It was here, beneath the summer sky, that a revolution was born. With Kent united behind Wat Tyler's leadership, the rebels began their bold march towards London. It was a sight unlike anything England had seen before. Thousands of peasants, artisans, and laborers streaming across the countryside, their voices echoing with chants of freedom and justice. The dusty roads became rivers of determined faces, each person carrying the weight of generations of oppression and the hope of a better future. The march was not merely a disorderly mob. Under Tyler's strict guidance, discipline was enforced. As he wanted the movement to be seen not as chaos, but as a righteous force demanding change. Despite this, tensions ran high. The sight of armed rebels terrified many towns along their route, and local officials often fled before the advancing crowd. Along the way, the rebels destroyed symbols of tyranny, burning tax records and freeing prisoners who had been jailed for unpaid debts. These acts were not wanton destruction, but calculated strikes against the oppressive machinery of the crown. John Ball traveled alongside the marchers, delivering sermons that rekindled their spirits during moments of fatigue. His words painted a vision of an England where all were free, where no man would serve another as a slave. This vision propelled the peasants forward, step by step, as they approached the city where the king resided. By the time the marchers reached the outskirts of London, their numbers had swelled to tens of thousands. The city's gates awaited them, and with it, the showdown that would determine whether their cries for freedom would be heard or crushed. As the rebels advanced toward London, their anger was directed not just at individuals, but at the very system that oppressed them. One of their most symbolic acts of defiance was the burning of tax records, the documents that bound peasants to unending debt and servitude. These records, kept in local manors, churches, and royal offices, represented the control and greed of the ruling elite. In every town they passed, the rebels sought out tax collectors' homes and government buildings. Scrolls, ledgers, and parchments were seized and dragged into the streets. With cries of freedom, the rebels piled them high, setting them alight as villagers gathered to watch. For the common people, this was not just an act of destruction, it was an act of liberation. The flames devoured the names and debts recorded on those pages, forting force, symbolically freeing countless families from the chains of financial oppression. Wat Tyler commanded that these actions be focused on symbols of tyranny, ensuring the rebellion retained a sense of purpose. John Ball's voice rang out over the crackle of fire, urging the peasants to remember their goal: a fairer, more just England, where no man would be crushed under unjust taxes. The air was thick with smoke, but also with hope. Every page turned to ash was a declaration that the peasants would no longer be silent or submissive. Their message to the crown was clear: the old order was crumbling, and the people were rising. As the rebels approached London, their first major obstacle was London Bridge, the heavily guarded gateway into the heart of the city. The bridge, with its stone towers and iron gates, was not just a crossing over the Thames, but a symbol of royal power and control. For the peasants, passing this bridge meant breaking through the barriers of the ruling elite and making their demands heard by the king himself. Wat Tyler led the charge with determination and strategy. He ordered the rebels to surround the southern end of the bridge, cutting off any chance for the guards to receive reinforcements. Armed with farming tools, clubs, and makeshift shields, the peasants were not as well equipped as the king's men, but their sheer numbers and fiery resolve made up for what they lacked in weapons. Confrontation was tense. Guards stationed on the bridge tried to hold back the masses with crossbows and spears, but the peasants pressed forward relentlessly, shouting cries of freedom. Smoke from previous fires in the surrounding villages still hung in the air, casting an eerie glow over the scene. After hours of standoff and pressure, the gatekeepers, overwhelmed by the sheer force of the rebels, opened the gates. The peasants surged onto the bridge, waving their flags of resistance and cheering as they crossed into the city. For the first time, London's walls trembled, not from an invading army, but from its own people rising up. News of the advancing rebels spread quickly through London, reaching the ears of the young king, Richard II, who was only 30 years old at the time. Though young, Richard was expected to act decisively to maintain royal authority. Advisors and nobles gathered around him in panic, urging him to crush the uprising. But the size and determination of the peasant army made a direct assault risky. The king's court was divided. Some lords argued for swift and violent retribution, warning that showing weakness would embolden the peasants. Others advised negotiation, fearing that the rebellion could spiral into full-scale civil war. Richard, under immense pressure, chose a cautious path. He sent envoys to meet the rebels and promised to listen to their grievances, hoping to buy time while preparing the city's defenses. The first royal messages were filled with promises of pardon and reform. But the peasants, weary of lies, were not so easily swayed. Wat Tyler and John Ball saw the king's hesitation as an opportunity to press their demands. They demanded the abolition of serfdom, fair taxation, and the freedom to work for wages rather than being bound to the land. Meanwhile, London was in chaos. Nobles feared for their lives as the rebels grew bolder, seizing supplies and spreading through the city's outskirts. Smoke from earlier fires drifted over the skyline, and the city's residents watched in fear as the standoff between crown and commoners escalated. The king's first response was not one of strength, but of uncertainty. His youth and inexperience made the peasants bolder. They saw in him not a mighty ruler, but a boy caught in a storm far greater than himself. The Tower of London, a fortress that had long stood as an unshakable symbol of royal power, faced one of its darkest days in June 1842. With the city in chaos, the peasants, led by Wat Tyler and inspired by John Ball, turned their attention to this mighty stronghold. Within its stone walls were some of the most despised figures of the king's court, including Archbishop Simon Sudbury, Chancellor of England, and Robert Hales, the royal treasurer. To the rebels, these men represented the crushing taxes and injustices that had driven them to revolt. The rebels, numbering in the thousands, surrounded the tower from all sides. Armed with farming tools, clubs, and stolen weapons, they were not highly trained, but their sheer determination was overwhelming. The guards, outnumbered and demoralized, were unable to mount a strong defense. With roaring chants of freedom and defiance, the peasants breached the gates, pouring into the tower's courtyards like a human tide. Inside, panic reigned. Servants fled, and officials tried in vain to hide behind thick wooden doors and tapestries. Simon Sudbury was dragged from his chambers, pleading for mercy. But the fury of the people, hardened by years of oppression, would not be denied. Sudbury and Hales were executed in a swift, brutal act of vengeance. Their heads were placed on spikes and paraded through the streets of London, a shocking display of the peasants' newfound power. The storming of the tower was more than a victory. It was a declaration that the common people were no longer willing to suffer in silence. For a brief moment, they had seized control of England's most feared fortress, shaking the monarchy to its core. Among the hated figures of King Richard II's court, none drew the wrath of the peasants more than Simon Sudbury, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and the king's chancellor. Sudbury was seen as one of the architects of the oppressive poll tax that had driven the peasants to revolt. When the rebels stormed the Tower of London, Sudbury's fate was sealed. Dragged from his hiding place, Sudbury was thrust before the furious crowd. His fine robes, embroidered with gold and crimson, stood in stark contrast to the mud-stained tunics of the rebels who surrounded him. The archbishop tried to reason with them, raising his voice over the chaos. "I have only served the king and the church," but his pleas fell on deaf ears. To the peasants, he was the face of their suffering and injustice. Wat Tyler, though a man of discipline, could not restrain the rage of the masses this time. As Sudbury was led to Tower Hill, the crowd swelled, chanting for justice. In a brutal and symbolic act, Sudbury was beheaded. His execution was not just a moment of revenge, but a declaration that the old order was under siege. The rebels displayed Sudbury's severed head on London Bridge, a chilling warning to the crown and the city. The people's anger had reached a point of no return. This gruesome spectacle cemented the seriousness of the revolt, shocking both nobles and commoners alike. For the first time in England's history, the people had struck directly at the heart of royal authority and emerged victorious, if only for a moment. With Simon Sudbury's death, the rebellion entered a new phase. No longer content with symbolic acts, the peasants now sought to make their voices heard directly by the king. As they occupied parts of London, they demanded reforms that would end centuries of oppression. Their demands were clear: the abolition of serfdom, fair taxation, and the right to freely work for wages. The peasants gathered in the city squares, shouting their grievances and singing songs of defiance. For the first time in English history, common people stood together as one, demanding to be treated as equals to the nobility. Wat Tyler and John Ball served as their spokesmen, articulating the desires of thousands who had long been voiceless. John Ball's words rang through the city. "Faces, things cannot go well in England until all things shall be held in common, and there shall be neither vassals nor lords." The streets of London echoed with the sound of hammers on shields and chants of unity. Merchants and townsfolk, initially wary of the rebels, began to sympathize with their cause. For many, the peasants' demands resonated with their own struggles against unfair taxes and corrupt officials. King Richard II, still at his palace, could no longer ignore the growing movement. The city's gates were under rebel control, and the Tower of London had fallen. For the first time in his short reign, the young king was forced to confront the reality that his throne stood on fragile ground. The voice of the peasants was not just noise, it was a cry for justice that could topple the kingdom if left unanswered. By mid-June, the voice of the rebels had grown too loud to ignore. The young King Richard II, realizing the gravity of the situation, agreed to meet with the peasant leaders. This was no small gesture. A king meeting commoners was unprecedented, a sign that the revolt had shaken the very foundations of England's feudal order. And more, that the revolt had shaken the very foundations of England's feudal order. The meeting was arranged at Mile End, just outside London. Tens of thousands of peasants stood waiting, their banners fluttering in the summer breeze. Wat Tyler, flanked by John Ball and other leaders, stepped forward as the spokesman for the people. The sight of the 60-year-old king, clad in gleaming armor and crowned with gold, contrasted sharply with the dusty and ragged appearance of the rebels. Wat Tyler presented the peasants' demands firmly: the abolition of serfdom, fair rents, freedom to work for wages, and general amnesty for those involved in the uprising. John Ball, standing beside him, added a moral weight to these requests, speaking of divine justice and equality. King Richard, though young, listened attentively. Perhaps sensing the dangerous resolve of the crowd, he agreed, at least in words, to grant many of their demands. Charters of freedom were hastily drafted and distributed among the peasants, promising liberty and relief from oppressive laws. Cheers erupted from the rebel ranks, many believing they had won a great victory. Yet behind the scenes, the king's advisors plotted. To them, these promises were temporary lies meant to pacify the mob. While the peasants celebrated, the crown prepared for a different kind of confrontation. The charters of freedom handed out at Mile End filled the peasants with hope. Many believed the long nightmare of feudal servitude was over. They returned to their villages carrying the king's promises like treasures, expecting a new dawn for England's common folk. It's built on deception. Behind the scenes, King Richard II's advisors were already planning to revoke every concession made to the peasants. As soon as the rebels dispersed from Mile End, royal troops were quietly mobilized. Nobles and landlords, outraged by the humiliation of negotiating with peasants, swore vengeance. The charters signed by the king were declared invalid, dismissed as mere tools to calm the mob. Word of this betrayal spread slowly, but when it reached the peasants, their joy turned to anger once more. Wat Tyler and John Ball, sensing the crown's treachery, called on the remaining rebels in London to regroup. The rebellion was far. Tyler urged his followers to stand firm and demand that the king honor his word, while Ball warned that the nobles would show no mercy if the peasants gave up now. The betrayal was a turning point. It hardened the resolve of the peasants who remained, but it also marked the beginning of the crown's counterattack. The king's soldiers began reclaiming control of key parts of London, Withing, Ike, while nobles plotted to lure the rebel leaders into a fatal trap. A confrontation between Wat Tyler and Richard II was inevitable, and the stage was set for the most dramatic showdown of the revolt. Warless on Sherwu June Ichen Sambai Bashir the fields of Smithfield, just outside the walls of London, became the stage for one of the most pivotal and tragic moments of the Peasants' Revolt. After days of tension, broken promises, and violence, a meeting was arranged between Wat Tyler, leader of the rebels, and King Richard II, the Shu-year-old monarch. The goal was to negotiate and, perhaps, avoid further bloodshed. But this meeting would end not with peace, but with betrayal and death. The atmosphere was charged with tension. Thousands of peasants stood in the background, their banners swaying in the summer breeze, while Richard II arrived on horseback, flanked by heavily armed royal guards and the Lord Mayor of London, William Walworth. Wat Tyler, proud and resolute, rode forward alone to present the demands of the people. He called for the complete abolition of serfdom, fair rents, and justice for all, speaking with the confidence of a man who knew he carried the voice of thousands. But the exchange quickly grew tense. Some accounts suggest that Tyler reached for his dagger, perhaps as a gesture of emphasis or defense, which Walworth took as a threat to the king. Acting swiftly, Walworth struck Tyler with his sword, wounding him gravely. Chaos erupted as the peasants cried out in shock. In that moment of confusion, King Richard II acted with unexpected boldness. Riding toward the panicked rebels, he declared, "Will you follow me? I am your king. I will be your leader." His words, spoken with calm authority, prevented the situation from spiraling into immediate violence. No, but Wat Tyler's fate was sealed. He was dragged away by royal forces, fatally wounded. His death shattered the morale of the rebels, marking the beginning of the revolt's decline. What began as a hopeful negotiation at Smithfield ended as a bloody turning point, cementing the crown's path to victory. The blow delivered at Smithfield left Wat Tyler fatally wounded, but the drama did not end there. As chaos erupted, the wounded leader was dragged away by royal guards under orders from William Walworth. Bleeding heavily, Tyler was taken to the nearby hospital of St. Bartholomew, but the crown had no intention of letting him survive. In secret, Walworth ordered his immediate execution. The man who had inspired thousands of peasants to rise up was beheaded, his head placed on a spike and displayed on London Bridge as a warning to all. For the rebels, the news of Tyler's death was a crushing blow. Their leader, fearless, charismatic, and unshakable, was gone. Many peasants stood in stunned silence, unable to comprehend how their cause could continue without him. Some wanted to fight, to avenge him then and there. Others, disheartened and leaderless, began to drift away from London, sensing that the rebellion was doomed without Tyler's guidance. King Richard II seized the moment. Showing a rare flash of cunning, he approached the confused peasants and proclaimed, "Will you have me for your leader? I am your king." His calm and commanding words, combined with the shock of Tyler's death, prevented immediate bloodshed. Many peasants, unsure of what to do, followed the king's orders to disperse, believing that perhaps he would still honor their demands. But Tyler's death was the beginning of the end. Without him to unify and inspire them, the rebels lost their strength. His fall marked the turning point where hope began to fade, and the crown regained control. With Wat Tyler dead, the rebellion lost its driving force. The peasants, once unified and fearless, began to scatter, leaving the movement vulnerable. The crown wasted no time in striking back. The charismatic priest John Ball, whose sermons had ignited the spark of rebellion, became the next target for royal vengeance. John Ball had tried to rally the remaining rebels after Tyler's death, urging them not to lose hope. His voice, once a beacon of inspiration, now carried a tone of desperation as he called for unity. But without Tyler's leadership and with the king's forces closing in, the scattered groups of peasants were quickly overwhelmed. By late June, Echen Sambai Bashiri, Ball was tracked down and captured near Coventry. The authorities viewed him not just as a rebel, but as a dangerous ideologue who had dared to challenge the church and the crown. Shackled and dragged to London, he was paraded as a symbol of the rebellion's failure. Even in chains, John Ball refused to recant his beliefs. He continued to speak of freedom and equality, addressing crowds as he was led through the streets. His courage and defiance impressed many, even among those who opposed him. But the crown was determined to silence him forever. Ball was sentenced to a brutal execution, hanged, drawn, and quartered, as both punishment and a warning to any who might follow in his footsteps. The capture of John Ball marked the final unraveling of the Peasants Revolt's leadership. The movement, which had once shaken the foundations of the kingdom, was now in its final tragic chapter. With Wat Tyler dead and John Ball in chains, the crown moved swiftly to crush the remaining sparks of rebellion. King Richard II, now emboldened, renounced the promises he had made at Mile End. The charters of freedom that had given hope to thousands were torn apart, and a wave of violent retaliation swept across England. Royal forces and noble militias descended upon the countryside, hunting down anyone suspected of supporting the revolt. Villages that had risen up were burned, and rebel leaders were executed in public squares to instill fear. Hangings became a common sight on the roads, with gallows erected in towns, as grim reminders of royal power. The once defiant peasants, who had marched on London with banners of hope, now faced the brutal reality of the king's wrath. The bloodshed was relentless. Those who tried to flee were often caught and punished, while families of suspected rebels were forced to pay heavy fines or forfeit their land. The uprising that had once united peasants, craftsmen, and laborers now crumbled under the weight of fear and violence. Still, pockets of resistance fought on, unwilling to surrender completely, but they were swiftly cut down. Richard II's brutal retaliation sent a clear message: the monarchy and the nobility would tolerate no challenge to their authority. Yet, even as the blood of peasants soaked the soil, their cries for freedom did not vanish. The memory of their courage and sacrifice would live on, fueling future struggles for justice in England. By late June, the once mighty Peasants' Revolt had crumbled. The death of Wat Tyler and the capture of John Ball left the movement leaderless, while King Richard II's cunning promises and subsequent betrayal had sapped the morale of the rebels. Without a central figure to unite them, the peasants scattered, retreating to their villages and hoping to avoid the wrath of royal retribution. Royal forces, emboldened by the rebels' weakened state, moved swiftly to reclaim control of London and the surrounding countryside. The rebels who remained in the city were hunted down, and their banners of freedom were torn apart. Many of the peasants who had marched proudly into the capital now faced execution or imprisonment. Those who returned to their homes found their villages under suspicion, with noble lords seeking revenge for the humiliation they had suffered. The rebellion's collapse was not due to lack of courage, but rather to the overwhelming power of the crown and its allies. The peasants had dared to challenge centuries of feudal tradition, but they lacked the weapons, organization, and resources to sustain their fight against the king's forces. Yet, even as the revolt was crushed, its spirit lingered. The fear it had struck into the nobility and the temporary concessions it had, forced from the crown, showed that the people's voice could not be ignored forever, though their immediate demands were not. The peasants had planted seeds of change that would take root in England's history. The collapse of the Peasants' Revolt unleashed a wave of brutal reprisals across England. King Richard II and his advisors, determined to make an example of the rebels, ordered a series of mass executions to instill fear in the hearts of the common people. The same peasants who had once marched proudly to London were now hunted, captured, and dragged to public squares for their punishment. Hangings became a grim spectacle, with gallows erected in marketplaces and crossroads. Villagers were forced to watch as their neighbors and family members were executed for participating in the uprising. Royal officials traveled through the countryside with lists of suspected rebels, sparing none who had openly challenged the king's authority. Those who could not pay hefty fines were either imprisoned or faced gruesome deaths. John Ball, the priest whose fiery sermons had inspired thousands, was among the first to face the crown's vengeance. He was hanged, drawn, and quartered, a fate reserved for traitors. Even in his final moments, Ball reportedly spoke of freedom and equality, his voice carrying across the crowd as a final message of defiance. The bloodshed was relentless. By the end of July, hundreds of peasants had been executed, and countless others had their lands seized or families ruined. The monarchy had reasserted its dominance, but at a cost. The cruelty of these punishments left deep scars, both physical and emotional, across the kingdom. Yet, the legacy of those who died would live on. The peasants' courage, their willingness to rise against injustice, and their ultimate sacrifice would echo through the centuries as a reminder of the power of ordinary people when united by a common cause. After the bloody suppression of the Peasants' Revolt, life for those who survived was harsh and uncertain. Villages that had once stood united against the crown were now haunted by fear and grief. Families mourned loved ones who had been executed or killed during the uprisings, while others faced crippling fines or the loss of their meager land. The rebellion, which had promised hope and change, left behind a trail of suffering for the common folk. King Richard II revoked all the charters of freedom he had granted during the negotiations at Mile End. The feudal system remained firmly in place, and the lords, now more cautious and vengeful, tightened their control over the peasantry. Tax collectors returned to the villages, demanding even greater payments to cover the costs of the royal crackdown. For many peasants, the struggle for survival became even more desperate. Yet, beneath the sorrow and fear, a subtle change had taken root. Though they had been defeated, the peasants realized that their collective strength had once shaken the crown. The Peasants' Revolt of Icen-Sambai-Basher-E, though brutally crushed, left an indelible mark on England's history. It was the first time in centuries that common men and women had risen as one to challenge the power of the monarchy, the nobility, and the church. Though their immediate demands were denied, the revolt revealed a powerful truth. The voice of the people, once united, could shake even the foundations of kings. In the years that followed, the memory of Wat Tyler, John Ball, and the countless unnamed peasants who sacrificed their lives became both a warning and an inspiration. To the ruling elite, the revolt was a reminder of the danger of pushing the common people too far. Harsh taxes like the poll tax were avoided for decades, and the fear of another uprising lingered in the minds of kings and nobles alike. For the common folk, the revolt planted seeds of hope and resilience. John Ball's radical words about equality and freedom were whispered for generations, influencing later movements for justice and reform. Though the feudal system did not end immediately, the revolt accelerated its decline. Over the next century, serfdom gradually disappeared from England, replaced by wage labor and a slow shift toward a more modern society. The Peasants' Revolt was not a failure, it was a turning point. It proved that ordinary people, no matter how poor or oppressed, could stand together and demand change. The courage of Icen-Sambai-Basher-E would echo through history, inspiring future generations to challenge tyranny and seek justice. The Peasants' Revolt of Icen-Sambai-Basher-E was more than just a violent uprising. It was a profound statement about justice, fairness, and the right of common people to challenge oppression. Though the immediate goals of the revolt were not achieved, its lessons echoed far beyond its bloody conclusion. It demonstrated that no king or noble could govern without considering the will of the people, no matter how lowly they were in the social order. One of the greatest lessons of the revolt was the power of unity. Ordinary peasants, artisans, and laborers, groups often divided by village or trade, came together as one force, united by shared suffering and common dreams of freedom. For a brief moment, their voices drowned out the might of the crown. It was proof that even the most marginalized could become a formidable power when united. Another lesson lay in the leadership of figures like Wat Tyler and John Ball, who inspired others with courage. Tyler's ability to organize and John Ball's fiery belief in equality were pivotal in rallying a scattered population into a movement that shook England to its core. Their legacy is a testament to the importance of visionaries who dare to speak for those who cannot. But the revolt also taught a darker lesson, that power does not yield easily. The king's betrayal of promises at Mile End showed how those in power would deceive and manipulate to maintain control. The brutal executions that followed revealed the lengths the ruling elite would go to suppress change. Even so, the revolt planted seeds of future reform. Over time, the rigid bonds of serfdom weakened, and the ideas of fairness and equality began to grow stronger. The Peasants' Revolt remains a reminder that the struggle for justice is rarely won in a single moment, but through the courage of those who rise again and again to challenge injustice, though often overlooked in it. Women played a vital role in the Peasants' Revolt of Bashar'i. From the fields of Kent to the streets of London, women stood shoulder to shoulder with men, sharing the burdens of rebellion and contributing to its momentum. They were not merely bystanders, but active participants, messengers, organizers, and, at times, fighters who risk everything for a chance at freedom. Women like Johanna Ferreur, who is recorded in Chronicles of the Revolt, led attacks against government officials and demanded justice for the poor. While men fought in the streets, women managed supplies, cooked for the rebel armies, and cared for the wounded. In the villages, they were the ones who rallied neighbors and whispered words of defiance. When the men's resolve wavered, the revolt gave women a rare opportunity to break free. Even briefly, from the rigid confines of medieval gender roles, many women boldly confronted tax collectors, arguing over unfair levies and refusing to let their families be impoverished. Some even took up arms, wielding whatever tools they could find, kitchen knives, iron pans, or sharpened stakes, to defend their homes and families. Women's involvement also brought a unique sense of unity and care to the movement. While the men sought justice through force, women were often the voices calling for compassion and fairness, even amidst the chaos. Their presence reminded everyone that the revolt was not just about power, but about the future of families, communities, and generations to come. Though history rarely names them, the courage of these women is woven into the fabric of the revolt's legacy. They stood not just for their husbands or sons, but for themselves, demanding dignity and equality in a world that had long denied them both. The Peasants' Revolt of Bashar'i gave birth to a host of heroes and martyrs, ordinary people who rose against oppression and paid the ultimate price for their courage. Though the revolt ended in defeat, these figures became legends, symbols of defiance that inspired generations long after their deaths. Wat Tyler stands at the forefront of these heroes. A humble craftsman from Kent, he became the voice of the common people, leading the charge to demand justice from the crown. His bold leadership and refusal to bow to authority transformed him into a legend. Tyler's death at Smithfield was not the end of his story. It elevated him to martyrdom. Even as his body fell, his name became a rallying cry for freedom. John Bull, the radical priest, also became a martyr for the cause. His sermons on equality challenged the very foundations of feudal England, and though he was brutally executed, his words lived on. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? This simple question outlived his tormentors and became the anthem of a movement that would echo across centuries. There were countless unnamed heroes too. Peasants who fought with nothing but scythes, women who defended their homes with knives, and children who carried water and food to the front lines. Many died anonymously, but their sacrifice was no less significant. The martyrs of Bashar'i remind us that history is often shaped not by kings and nobles, but by those who dare to stand against them. Their courage, though punished with death, carved a path for future generations to question authority and demand change. Over the centuries, the story of the Peasants' Revolt of Bashar'i has been told and retold, often shrouded in myths and misconceptions. While the revolt was one of the most significant uprisings in medieval England, the details have sometimes been distorted, either by chroniclers of the time, who wrote from the perspective of the crown, or by later historians seeking to romanticize or vilify the event. One common misconception is that the peasants were nothing more than a violent mob, bent on chaos and destruction. In reality, the revolt was organized and purposeful. Under Wat Tyler's leadership, the rebels maintained discipline, targeting symbols of oppression rather than indiscriminately looting and killing. It was only after Tyler's death and the betrayal by the crown that chaos spread among the disheartened rebels. Another myth is that the revolt was a failure. While it did not achieve immediate success, serfdom was not abolished overnight. The uprising shook the foundations of feudal England. It forced the ruling class to confront the growing unrest among the common people, and it marked the beginning of the decline of serfdom, which gradually faded in the following century. There are also exaggerated tales of the brutality of the peasants, often penned by chroniclers who sought to demonize them. While there were violent acts, much of it was in retaliation to decades of exploitation and harsh taxation. The rebels' demands were surprisingly progressive, focusing on fairness, freedom, and justice rather than revenge. Lastly, the roles of women and ordinary villagers have often been downplayed or forgotten. Figures like Johanna Ferreur have been largely erased from popular history, despite their vital contributions to the cause. Recognizing these voices challenges the traditional, male-dominated narratives of the time. Separating fact from fiction is crucial to understanding the true significance of the Peasants' Revolt. It was not a meaningless rebellion, but a brave and calculated attempt to reshape society, a legacy that deserves to be remembered with clarity and respect. The Peasants' Revolt of 1592 was short-lived, but its impact rippled far beyond the blood-soaked fields and burned villages of that summer. Though crushed by royal power and treachery, the revolt fundamentally altered the relationship between the ruling elite and the common people of England. The echoes of Wat Tyler's courage and John Ball's fiery words would linger for centuries. In the immediate aftermath, the crown tried to erase all traces of the uprising, executing leaders, revoking promises. Yet the revolt had shaken the confidence of the monarchy and the nobility. Never before had a force of common laborers, farmers, and artisans come so close to challenging royal authority. The fear it instilled in the upper classes led to the abandonment of the hated poll tax and a gradual rethinking of how the kingdom's wealth and resources were managed. The Peasants' Revolt of 1592 was a brief but thunderous moment in English history, a time when the powerless dared to rise against the powerful, demanding dignity and justice. Though their immediate goals were crushed under the weight of royal retaliation, their courage and defiance left an enduring legacy. The revolt revealed the deep fractures in medieval society. It showed that the people, though bound by law and tradition, were not mere shadows in the fields, but voices capable of shaking the halls of power. Wat Tyler's fearless leadership, John Ball's revolutionary sermons, and Johanna Ferreur's fiery spirit live on as symbols of resistance against injustice. The story of 1592 is not simply one of failure. It is a testament to the power of unity and the unbreakable human desire for freedom. The peasants who marched on London may not have seen the fruits of their struggle, but they planted seeds that would grow over the centuries, eventually shaping a more equitable society. In reflecting on the Peasants' Revolt, we remember not only the heroes who led, but also the countless, ordinary men and women who dared to dream of a better world. And their sacrifice reminds us that history is forged not just by kings and nobles, but by the courage of common people who refuse to accept injustice. Thank you for joining us on this journey through one of the most extraordinary chapters in England's history, the Peasants' Revolt of Ichen Sambai Bashiri. This story is not just about battles or rebellion, it is about the courage of ordinary people who dared to demand change, even in a world that seemed immovable. Wat Tyler, John Ball, Johanna Ferrur, and the countless unnamed peasants who stood against the crown remind us that history is shaped not only by rulers, but by the collective voices of the oppressed. Though the revolt ended in blood and betrayal, its spirit endures as a powerful reminder of unity, resilience, and the fight for justice. The lessons of Ichen Sambai Bashiri about courage in the face of tyranny and the power of solidarity are as relevant today as they were over 6 centuries ago. If you found this story inspiring, we invite you to reflect on the struggles and triumphs of the past and consider how they shape our present. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more historical journeys that bring the forgotten voices of the past to life. Together, let's keep these stories alive. Thank you for watching,